Welcome back, family. Black House Live. We will continue in our book lecture series. We left off discussing chapter 1, What is Power? Today we'll be discussing chapter 2 of Blueprint for Black Power titled Organization and Ethnic Resources. So I'm so excited to be getting back into this with you guys. According to Dr. Wilson, social power is most effective when a power holder has and controls important and valuable social resources. All right. These power holders strategically reward or deprive these resources, right, as a way to influence behavior in ways that suit the interests of the power holder. So the power holder recognizes that strategically they possess resources, right, that others just don't have, right? And as a way to maintain that competitive edge that they have, they can decide to either supply, right, or deprive those resources to those outsiders. According to Dr. Wilson, when resources are used in this strategic way, they are called power bases, and they could include physical safety, health, well-being, wealth, and material possession. Social power then is a relationship between individual groups that control resources that are desired and needed by others. So social power is a relationship between those who have and those who don't have. It is a relationship in essence where the folks who possess the resources are able to control the individuals who don't have resources, essentially. So again, social power is exercised when an individual and or group power holder strategically supplies or withhold those resources. And according to Dr. Wilson, the resources that are most important to the African-American community, right, is property, organization, race consciousness, which he also refers to as ethnic solidarity, and ideology. And, you know, obviously we could discuss a whole litany, a wide list of other resources, but for the purposes of this economic plan that Dr. Amos Wilson is laying out, these four are primary, and we'll come to understand why. Power relations in a society is largely a byproduct of those with property and those without property, right? Those haves and have-nots. For those who have property, those who don't have it. And according to Dr. Wilson, the property lists are compelled to bow to the demands of the propertied as a condition for obtaining their daily bread. And so given that the property lists do not control their own property, they don't own their own homes, right? They don't control the means to provide their own daily lodging. They will have to be at the behest of someone else, right? And given that there's that need, if you don't own property, then you will need the bank, or you'll need a mortgage, or you'll need a landlord in a particular type of way. Then that landlord, that bank, that mortgagor has leverage, and they can leverage our needs, right, to work toward their own interests. Dr. Wilson wants to make it clear that the property power differential is not the result of Black inferiority. It's not the lack of some economic genius on behalf of African American people, but is the result of a white monopolistic ownership of property, right? The result of genocide of the native peoples, the enslavement of African peoples, and the exploitation of their labor, right? It produces the results that we see today, where whites disproportionately control 90 some odd percent of this land. Whites were able to steal land and profit from that theft. The solution then to this property power differential that exists is pretty self-explanatory, according to Dr. Amos Wilson. He says that since with property comes power, it stands to reason that if African Americans are to obtain substantial and sustainable power, they must obtain control of substantial property, and with it, substantial economic power. Right. And so the rapid accumulation and applied organization of property and wealth by any means necessary must become the top priority goals of the African American community. Dr. Wilson mentions no words about this. The solution to this property power differential that we were just discussing is African American people acquiring property by any means necessary. And I think it's important, right? We can kind of even lay on that point, right, by any means necessary, because in the previous slide, we were discussing the ways in which white monopolistic power stole and exploited, right, this land from Native folks, from African people. And so this idea that we have to engage in a legal means of acquiring our land back that was robbed and stolen from us in the first place is a ridiculous notion. And so Amos Wilson doesn't put any stipulations on how African people acquire or reacquire this land. He simply says by any means necessary. And I love it. Organization is working power. Dr. Wilson says that simply possessing property does not ensure the development and distribution of effective power. In order for power to be effective, the power holder must be organized, right? And so working power is defined as the organization of power on the part of the dominant group. And in this instance, we're talking about whites, in contrast to the relative disorganization of the subordinate group, which are blacks in this instance, right? To ensure their control over this subordinate group, right? This is another one of those power differentials that have to be neutralized. Working power, right? White folks should not be the only folks that have a monopoly over working power, okay? The ability as a dominant group in contrast to, right, disorganized subordinate groups. We as Black organizations, we as Black businesses have to be able to organize ourselves strategically and around the resources that we possess as a community, right? Strategically supplying and depriving those resources to outsiders, right? And what Amos Wilson is showing us here is that for far too long, historically, white folks are the only ones who've been able to use their working power toward their interests, right? We as Black people have not been able to use our working power to our own interests. Social power is the uniting of a number of persons into a group through the use of their resources, right? To achieve their group's purposes and goals. And so social power is the uniting of these Black businesses. These Black businesses, once united, will be able to actualize their social power. The solution to disorganized social power, according to Dr. Wilson, is to pool our resources with the intention of exercising power over all non-members, right, of our communities. By pooling our resources, by putting them together, we're able to demonstrate power, right, over all other non-group members. If folks want to do business with us, they have to do it on our terms, right? If folks want to engage with us, they have to engage on our terms, right? And the only way that we can enforce this is through us being organized. The reason why folks currently do not have to align with our interests when they come into our communities and set businesses up, right? The reason why they don't have to align with our interests when they come into our communities and establish properties or buy properties is because Black businesses, right, in those communities, if there are any that exist, are disorganized. And Dr. Amos Wilson is saying that once Black businesses organize effectively, whether or not there are specific Black businesses in any specific community or not, that power network is so strong, right, that it is able to influence and dictate what happens, right, in those regions and areas as well. We'll get there. So according to Dr. Wilson, a social organization is composed of two or more persons or groups of persons, each behaving as a component part of the organized whole, and coordinated in some special way to perform work and achieve definite outcomes. Social organizations exert influence on their membership in such ways as to achieve definite effects on the internal and external environment. And so based on the actions and intended results and outcomes for those social organizations, they can be conceived of as power networks, all right? And so, based off of what I just said, by organizing these Black businesses around the resources that they have strategically, right, we can now start to inform governmental policy. We can now start to inform public education policy. We can now start to inform healthcare policy, right? We become a power base based off of strategically organizing our resources in specific regions around the country and around the world. According to Dr. Wilson, there are four sources of social power. There's ideological, economic, military, and political, right? And he goes on to say that social organizations as power networks are structured forms of social control. So once these organized Black businesses come together and we organize these resources that we have, again, we can now start to apply a certain level of control over our communities. Social organizations are a collective source of power. As Black organizations strategically unite and maximize their resources, those social organizations are able to organize, coordinate, specialize, and divide labor as a collective, right? Once Black businesses are able to come together, once we organize, right, we can now start to collectively put our people into places, into strategic positions. We can start to hire our own people, right? We don't have to consult with anyone. We know who the geniuses are in our communities. We know where the expertise lie in our community, right? And once organized, we can now start to put those people in very specific positions. Collectively, these Black organizations will be able to distribute their power along their interests. So we have collective and distributive power, right? Once those Black businesses come together, we're able to actualize our collective power, right? And then we're able to distribute those resources strategically along our economic, political, cultural, social interests. Dr. Wilson juxtaposes social organizations that are well organized versus weakly organized. And he also refers to weakly organized organizations as disunited individuals. And so weaker organizations not only lend themselves to being outmaneuvered, outvoted, outbidded, right? But essentially they end up complying with the demands of stronger organized groups. They end up becoming tools to be used by dominant groups. And so when Black organizations, Black businesses, Black institutions are not organized, right, and are weakly organized, once they start to lose resources, once they start to lose relevancy and things of that nature in the community, they can be absorbed by these larger white corporations, businesses, and entities, right, to serve their interests and no longer serve the interests of the community. So Dr. Wilson defines extensive power as an organization's ability to organize large numbers of people over far territories to engage in cooperation, right? We may not have 15, 20, 40, 50 Black businesses in one city. Thus, it will be important for us to be able to organize, right, Black businesses across the United States. And so how organized, how effective is this race organization that we're developing and being able to organize its members across states, right? Or across continents even. That's extensive power. And then intensive power is more local, it's smaller. And so organizations' ability to be able to organize tightly and command a high level of mobilization, right, of its membership that's local. That's right there. So when it comes time to make decisions, when it comes time to organize the masses, right, for demonstrations and particular programs, how effective are our Black organizations, Black institutions at being able to get their membership to mobilize? And we're just talking on the local level, on the community level. So extensive and intensive. According to Dr. Wilson, he defines authoritative power as a degree to which participants willingly comply to the commands and the recommendations of its legitimate institutions and authorities. And we have to remember here that these Black businesses and institutions are no longer operating as individual businesses. They're now part of a collective, all right? And so authoritative power is the degree to which participants willingly understand and see themselves, right, as a part of this collective, and thus alter their objectives, their mission, and their vision, right, to the needs of the collective and no longer just to their individual constituencies. Dr. Wilson defines diffused power as the degree to which participants spontaneously and consciously and unconsciously start to comport their behaviors, right, to meet what the race organization is doing. Right? Diffused power is the degree to which participants spontaneously, consciously, and unconsciously, individually, and on their own free will engage in similar social practices because they recognize that what is happening, what these organized Black businesses are doing is in the best interest of the entire community. According to Dr. Wilson, social organization's ability to maximize these forms of power, right? Whether it's extensive, intensive, whether it's authoritative or diffused, right? Is a byproduct of those members being acutely aware of those values and characteristics that bind them together. By these Black social organizations, these Black businesses, the way in which we'll be able to actualize this power and maximize our power is largely based on our ability to be able to get us to understand why we have chose to mobilize, coalesce, and come together in the first place, right? What are the unique characteristics and qualities that binds us as an organization, that connects us as businesses, right? And now let's use those characteristics to get this work done, to be about this work. These powers collectively work to enhance the group's social power, their collective identity, their collective consciousness, their collective intentionality, and collective solidarity. We are going to use these characteristics that bind us, these characteristics that make us all like-minded. We're going to use these characteristics to be able to go out and recruit others, to be able to move as a collective of one mind, and to get out of this individualistic type of thinking. Let's keep moving. So according to Dr. Wilson, social organizations are encouraged to organize not just around common resources, but to strategically organize based on collective identity, right? So how do we see ourselves, right? As Black financiers, as Black bankers, as Black educators, right? As Black grocers, Black farmers. What is our collective identity? And this collective identity also refers to as collective solidarity. According to Dr. Wilson, it is the fundamental resources that make mobilization possible. These are the means by which we are going to be able to mobilize the masses. It's through this collective identity, through this collective consciousness and collective solidarity. If the masses are not able to identify themselves with this movement and with this organization, they are not going to join. Right? But where the masses can see themselves reflected in this organization, then they will they'll come out in numbers. And so groups are mobilizing based on the collective identity, based on the solidarity to the mission, purpose, and goals of the social organization. So according to Dr. Wilson, social solidarity is critical to the accumulation of collective resources. If we are going to be able to mobilize, right, and bring these strategic resources together, then we're going to have to be able to get Black business owners to see themselves as a part of this collective. The purpose of ethnic solidarity and social organizations among African Americans, right, is to counter white domination. What are we doing this for? Why are we asking Black businesses, Black CEOs, Black entrepreneurs, right, to coalesce and come together? It is because we are trying to end white domination in our communities and the world over. According to Dr. Wilson, the struggle for power is a struggle between organizations, largely, right? The power of highly organized groups can only be checked by the opposition of other highly organized groups, right? A weakly organized group can't check a highly organized group, right? We've ever heard the phrase, right? Small, your arms are too small to box with God. And for the longest of time, the African American community arms have been too small to box with the more dominant group, right? To end this oppression, end this domination. And so well-organized groups have the ability to exert coordinated membership responses. Um, Dr. Wilson defines coordinated membership responses as planned and concerted action to affect social decisions, right? So where these Black businesses and institutions recognize that they're not being listened to, they're not being consulted, right, on social and national issues, right? These Black businesses and institutions can consult with their membership and their constituencies to coordinate a collective response where all of its membership will respond in a planned and concerted action, right? And by doing this, we have the ability to impact, again, foreign policy, educational policy, healthcare policy, military policy, right? All of that. When we have these coordinated membership responses, as opposed to these kind of sporadic and spontaneous and schizophrenic responses that we tend to see happen in community when Black and brown people are oppressed. There's a few factors that affect group power and groups' ability to really be actualize their power. And a few of them that are pointed out here and are discussed here is size and organizational power, cohesiveness, perceived role as power, organizational alliance, and countervailing power. So as Dr. Amos Wilson gives us a few factors that he argues affects group power. And so let's start with size and organizational power, right? So large organizations become active and powerful when their vital interests are threatened, right? You have some of these organizations, and Black organizations, that don't know how to become active, right, and become vibrant until their organization's life is threatened, right? Cohesiveness and action orientation, the ability to unite one's group in a given program for a given purpose without the need of outside decision makers. Many Black organizations, Black institutions are still dependent on philanthropic dollars and resources, right? And we know that with that philanthropy comes outside decision makers. And so we have not gotten to a place where we can grassroots organize and become independently financed organizations and institutions. Perceived role is power. The group's personal image and mission can conflict with how the community sees the purpose and mission of the group, and then vice versa. The community can have expectations of the group that are unrealistic, right? And so you have many Black businesses and organizations that are handicapped by their missions and visions, that believe that they can't possibly go outside, right, those missions and visions and create other realities. And the community comes to see these Black businesses and Black institutions as only these one things, right? And the community has these blinders and an inability to view this Black business and institution in a more creative kind of way, right? And so Dr. Amos Wilson also talks about organizational alliances, strategically aligning and partnering with other organizations that make it easy for cooperation and operating social control. And so there's still a tremendous need for Black businesses, Black organizations to strategically align with the right businesses, to strategically align with the right organizations. And then I just think this last one is self-explanatory, countervailing powers, where groups spending unnecessary time and resources opposing other organizations rather than cooperating. And so, you know, spending this time tearing other organizations, other businesses down prevents us from and takes away from the vital and necessary work that we have to be doing in community. Let's keep it moving. Social power of the unorganized masses. So we've been talking about the way in which we can actualize our extensive, intensive, authoritative, and diffuse power, right, as a collective. But Amos Wilson reminds us that the unorganized masses display powers, whether they know it or not. And one of those examples is the power of the mass markets. And in a democratic society, the masses exert influence through their choices of what goods to buy, right? And therefore, the masses may exert influence and power through choosing what to buy or what not to buy. All right. What politicians to support, what politicians not to support. Okay. What organizations we are going to frequent, what businesses we are going to frequent, which organizations and businesses we are not going to frequent, right? We're able to be strategic in the market in that particular type of way, right? Similarly, he talks about the mass veto power through non-cooperation. And so wherever a decision cannot be effective without mass cooperation, the veto power of the masses must be considered, right? When Black folks are not being consulted, when our ideas are not being sought after, then we can choose as a mass organization to not cooperate with whatever political agenda is being offered at that moment in time. And then there's the direct political power of the masses. The masses uses the elite's need for their support, right? We can leverage this need that the Republicans and the Democrats all seem to need every political cycle, all right? And Dr. Wilson adds another one, right? He adds the breaking of the habit of obedience. I love this. It says in an unjust social order, in an order where one group abusively dominates another, the habit of obedience in the subordinate or abused group functions to maintain that order. Subordinate groups thereby collude with the dominant group to perpetuate its own subordination and exploitation. The situation can only be changed by the destabilization and the breakdown of the unjust social order. Complying with the current status quo is to give legitimacy to this unjust society. To continue to follow its laws gives legitimacy and authorization to the dominant group to continue, right? This evil and racist behavior. The situation can only be changed, Dr. Wilson reminds us, by the destabilization and breakdown of the unjust social order, by radically reorganizing its structure of power relations. This can only be brought about by the subordinate group's refusal to comply with the demands of the dominant group. He goes on to say this may not only include the refusal to cooperate with unjust laws, but may include boycotting and refusing to consume certain goods and services sold by dominant groups, disrupting the social order and behavioral routines and machinery, which maintains the operation of dominant social order. We're gonna have to change our behavior and stop blindly going along to get along, right? We are going to have to destabilize and break down this current unjust social order. According to Dr. Wilson, ethnic solidarity is achieved once collective social organizations are mobilized and are facilitating a group ideology, where previously disunited individuals remained in isolation, struggling to activate power. We can say that group solidarity or ethnic solidarity has been achieved once these Black organizations have been mobilized, right? And mobilized behind a particular ideology. Okay? We got a number of Black businesses that are joining and creating, new clubs and titles and names. But what is that ideology? What's the group's ideology? According to Dr. Wilson, who cites Light and Bonnich's term of immigrant entrepreneurship, Amos Wilson takes that term, right, of immigrant entrepreneurship, and he coins the term ethnic entrepreneurship. And essentially, right, when we break this down for Black and brown women and men, what this basically is our ability to be able to hire our own people, our ability to be able to put our own people on and put them in positions of power, right? It's what ethnic entrepreneurship is ultimately about. These resources are used to sustain our competitive position and competitive edge relative to other ethnic groups. And so through us being able to hire our own and put our own people in strategic positions, right? So that we create these jobs and employment for self. But these entrepreneurs are explained through the resources that they control, right? And we're strategically using these resources as a way to maintain our competitive advantage. What are some examples of ethnic resources? Well, according to Dr. Wilson, some examples of ethnic resources are values, knowledge, skills, information, attitude, leadership, solidarity, and orientation, and institutions. There was a time in our history, right, where there was certain information and science that was only known, right, in certain parts of the world. Different civilizations were advancing, right, at different speeds and at different times. And if you were a civilization that came into nautical information, right, faster than your contemporaries, then what that meant was that you were able to build boats, you were able to explore and navigate the seas, right, in ways that your competitors just weren't able to do, right? When other civilizations were starting to develop medical breakthroughs, right, they were able to save their civilization from basic ailments, diseases, and sicknesses and injuries, right? That the rival civilizations and competitors just couldn't do, right? And so, in the same ways, even today, different ethnic groups possess resources that others don't have. They possess certain knowledge and skills that other groups just don't have, right? And so, how do we leverage this? How do we leverage these ethnic resources, right, in the best interest for the Black community? So according to Dr. Wilson, who cites Light and Bondage's term of class resources, these resources include material factors such as private property and ownership, right? Ownership of a means of production and distribution, personal familial wealth, investments in human capital like education and training, cultural resources. According to Dr. Wilson, he argues that Light and Bondage's research found similar conclusions that the Blueprint for Black Power found, and that was that the ownership of property, wealth, organization, race consciousness, and ideology as potential and actual power resources can be combined to increase group well-being and power, right? The ownership of property, the ownership of wealth, Black businesses organizing themselves, right, around this race conscious and race ideology, right? By combining those things, this is what's going to allow us to increase our group's well-being and power. And so the essence of the economic organization and power does not revolve around the mere possession of money and property and human resources, right? But that it is about this cohesive, coherent group ideology and consciousness that we are going to establish, right? That is going to be most important than just the mere possessing of possessions, right? We can have all this wealth, we can have all this land, but if we're still thinking as individuals, right, then it's going to allow us to be co-opted. That opens us up to still being controlled and being used, right, for others' interests. But once we are socially organized, it lends itself to us being more conscientious of our own interests and being able to protect our own interests from outside influence. Ideology based on group identity. According to Dr. Wilson, a group whose members share a strong sense of identity and purpose possesses the preconditions and prerequisites for their power, right? Their shared language, their shared custom, their shared beliefs are already the basis, right? And the foundation that they will continue to build off of, right? As they are actualizing power in society. So these factors and orientations coalesce to form a group-based idea system, philosophy, and ideology. All right, based on these shared values, based on the shared knowledge that we have, we're able to create an ideology that says that when we go out into the world and we do this work, we do it this way. We do it with these people. We move in this way. We utilize these principles. And then all of that is a byproduct of our group ideology. Wilson argues that an ideology based on group identity and interest is a precondition of the formation of any organization. He argues that the absence of a coherent, strongly held ethnicity-based system of ideas in the African-American community is what has left us open to being pillaged and exploited by outsiders. Economic race-based ideology. African Americans, for the most part, right, we have been excluded from or marginalized, right, in the American Eurocentric marketplace. And a lot of this, Wilson argues, is a result of an absence of a strongly held African-centered economic ideology. According to Dr. Wilson, he reminds us the economic subordination of Black Americans is not the result of some erstwhile natural anti-economic tendency, right, of Black folks. Black American economic subordination is the result of deliberate economic oppression by other groups, primarily the white American community, aided and abetted by immigrant groups, and secondarily, the result of the failure of the African American leadership to forge a race-based ideological consensus and economic program. The African American community must organize itself to take power. The reason why we find ourselves, right, in the economic power differential that we find ourselves in, right, is because we have not created a race-based ideology that says we are going to fight for ourselves. We are going to do for ourselves. We're only going to do business with us. Right? We allow anybody to come into our business and set up shop. Folks offer us any price for these goods and we just giving it up. We have the largest influential genre of music, right? And yet we don't set the prices of what our music and what our art is going to be sold for. We don't set the prices for what our tours are going to be, charged and things of that nature. Yet we are huge cultural influencers. The African American community must organize itself to take power. We're going to discuss in our next lecture how to best organize, right, these Black businesses and organizations, how best to organize the Black community and things of that nature, right? And Dr. Wilson offers a suggestion as to how to do that, right? In ways in which the leadership, the organizing and the structuring of this leadership can happen. But again, this is just one potential example. We will see others, we'll hear of others as well. And so it provides this flow chart of a proposed African-American national political and economic system. And so there's this president of councils, right? And then you'll recognize that this leadership is broken down nationally, right? On the state level and then on the local levels as well. And so through a national council of presidents of these major Black organizations and institutions, right? This next level, there's a national executive officer of economic development, education, and external relations, right? On a state level, there are regional councils of presidents of major Black organizations and institutions, right? In the local level, local councils of major Black organizations and institutions, and then on the community level, right? Individuals, groups, organizations, and institutions. And we will see clearly ways in which this can kind of play itself out and formulate it. But this is just one potential way of organizing, right? Black businesses in our community along that framework. It goes without saying that these bases of retail service outlets, distribution centers, et cetera, that I'm going to discuss here, when we discuss phases of development, we tend to think that, it has to happen chronologically. That this phase has to happen first before the next phase can happen. Amos Wilson wants to remind us at the very beginning, these phases do not have to happen chronologically, but that they can happen simultaneously, right? In order for us to get to where we need to get, we recognize that there's a lot of work that has to be done in the community, y'all, right? And so we don't have the time, the luxury of time of waiting for this one thing to get done in order for us to do the next thing. A lot of this work is going to have to be done side by side and simultaneously. So according to Dr. Wilson, the full development of an African American economic system requires that it undergoes a number of phases, right? One being the founding and establishing of broad bases of retail and service outlets by individuals, partners, corporate groups, institutions, professionals, and labor organizations, right? There has to be the institution of wholesale and distribution centers, right? The Europeans got them. They got Costco's. We got Sam Clubs, right? We have all these major distribution centers, right? For white folk in our community, nationally, globally, we have to create them as well. The founding and expansion of manufacturing and raw material sectors, the founding and expansion of the financial sectors. We need our own banks. We need our own credit unions. The entering into export-import trade relations across the African diaspora as part of a global Pan-African economic system, right? And so we're not getting into the business, right, of organizing ourselves and organizing our businesses just to do business with Eurocentric folks, right, and Europeans. We do want to see the African continent thrive. We want to see the African economy thrive. And so we have to be thinking now in the development of this race organization, this race organizing, how we are going to import and export trade with the African diaspora. Dr. Wilson explains that one of the reasons we've continued to be dominated by white folks is because we have failed to understand and think of ourselves as a nation within a nation. According to Dr. Wilson, well-organized, socially coherent, and cohesive nation states provides the best means for the accumulation and the exercise of collective power resources. He goes on to argue that the failure of the African-American community to exercise considerable economic and political power, despite its large population and broad national expanse, right, is directly linked to its failure to conceive of itself as a nation within a larger white American-dominated nation. The failure of the African American community to think of and organize itself as a nation in America means that it cannot maximize its power, right, in our best interest. Until we start to think of ourselves as a nation within a nation, we won't be able to actualize our power, right? So what do nations do, right? Nations set agendas, right? Nations protect themselves from outside forces. And so Black folks have to start to think of themselves, African folks have to start to think of themselves wherever they are in the diaspora as a nation within whatever nation they are located in, right? And get about the work of liberating themselves and freeing themselves. According to Dr. Wilson, if Black America is to actualize and exert its tremendous potential for power, it must organize itself to do so. And so the African American community not only faces further subordination and exploitation, but possible annihilation if we don't organize. So according to Dr. Wilson, Dr. Chancellor Williams in The Destruction of the Black Civilization outlines a race-based plan for organization. My next lecture is going to outline chapters 13, 14, and 15 of The Destruction of the Black Civilization and how it specifically speaks to this plan, right? How it speaks to Amos Wilson's need of organizing ourselves, right, as a nation within a nation. The best means of organizing ourselves, right, to get free. And so our next lecture is going to cover chapters 13, 14, and 15 of The Destruction of the Black Civilization. Before we do that though, right, Amos Wilson wants to give some of the benefits. What were the benefits of Chancellor Williams' plan, right, that he outlined? He says that it can influence American foreign policy. By us organizing ourselves in this particular type of way, we're able to make certain demands, right, on America's foreign policy. And overall, race organization can deal with the important problems and serve as a national defender. There's no one that can say that Black folks, African folks don't need somebody to protect them. We have been exploited for far too long. It can carry on a nationwide education program directly into homes, right? And so this is a program that is geared toward the mental liberation the cultural revolution of African people. And so we're talking about a program that can be produced and given to our children right in their own homes. It protects the African American community from serving as guinea pigs in dangerous experiments. We recognize that these Eurocentric governments do not have our best interests at heart, and thus have used Black and brown people to advance its sciences and advance its technology. The ownership of vast tracts of farm and timberland. And so the number one of the main focuses of this race organizing would be about the acquiring of land by any means necessary. A central national bank as the people's depository, a central financing agency, a national auditing and accounting service, right? And so a whole scale development of our financial and economic system this plan speaks to. It can give hope and new sense of direction to the thousands behind prison walls, right? And in time, practically empty the prisons of those convicted of crimes for which the whites go free. In Dr. In Dr. Chancellor Williams' plan specifically, he talks about how we can organize prisoners and ex-prisoners for this work. There's so much work to be done. We ain't got time to be beating little old ladies over the head and robbing and taking their purses. We don't have time to be killing each other, right? Because we be so busy about getting this work done and freeing ourselves and liberating ourselves that we'd have no time for this. The youth would be inspired by their parents and older generations for the movement work that's being done, right? Our children would be able to look up at us and be inspired by the work that they see being done in community, right? Not only for this generation, but for future generations as well. That's something that we need to bring back to community. Our children being excited about who and what we are. Finally, and obviously none of the above can be achieved on a nationwide scale without a nationwide movement of several million members organized as a race. Dr. Wilson refers to Dr. Williams' master plan in chapter 15, which included the following divisions: economic planning and development, political action, public education, intelligence and security, and the commission for spiritual assistance. Each of these things I'm going to be highlighting and discussing further in our next lecture. But according to Dr. Wilson, member organizations should be unequivocally Afrocentric in composition, structure, and purpose. They should avoid the influence in or the leadership of their organization by persons tied to the Republican, Democratic parties, Marxist groups, proselytizing or overzealous religious groups, Eurocentric socialists and assimilationists. The reason being is that the inclusion of such groups, because of their ambivalent loyalties and conflicting priorities and values, surely will be the death knell of organizations committed to the advancement of African peoples. By involving and convoluting our race organization with the Marxist ideologies, with the Republican and the Democratic ideologies, we cloud our Black business and Black institutions, our Black organizing, right, with these agendas. Our agenda gets pushed to the back burner, right? And we now become about advancing the cause, right, of Marxism, advancing the cause of Republicanism and the Democrat movement. Family, we are going to end here. This concludes chapter 2 of Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power, Organization and Ethnic Resources. Again, our next lecture will focus on chapters 13, 14, and 15 of the Destruction of the Black Civilization and how it supplements Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power as a means for organizing the race. I look forward to meeting with you all. Peace, family, and until next time.